The world felt like it was holding its breath the day Elias Turner left his grandparents' creaky old house in Willow Creek, Tennessee. At 16, he stood on their porch, heart pounding like a drum, clutching a duffel bag stuffed with his life clothes, a worn copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and a photo of him and his grandparents at the county fair. All smiles and cotton candy. He wasn't ready to leave, but his mother's letter, sharp and insistent, had arrived like a court summons. It's time you come live with me in Atlanta. Elias had grown up under the warm, unwavering love of his grandparents, Ruth and Amos. They were old school, with their Sunday church routines and a kitchen that always smelled of cornbread. But they'd embraced him when he came out at 13. God don't make mistakes, Ruth had said, pulling him into a hug that smelled of lavender and flower. Amos, gruff as he was, had just nodded and handed him a fishing rod, saying, "You're still my boy." Their acceptance was a soft place to land in a town where whispers about that Turner kid followed him like shadows. Willow Creek wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either, not to a skinny, openly gay teenager who wore his heart on his sleeve. The move to Atlanta was supposed to be a fresh start. His mother, Carla, had left him with her parents when he was 2, chasing a life that didn't include a toddler. Now, at 38, she claimed she was ready to be a mother. Elias wasn't so sure. Her apartment in the city felt cold, all sharp edges and glass tables. Nothing like the cluttered warmth of his grandparents' home. Carla was a stranger with his eyes blue, searching, a little too bright. She worked long hours at a law firm, leaving him alone in a place that echoed with silence. School was worse. At Westview High, Elias was the new kid, the rural transplant with a faint southern drawl and a secret he wasn't sure he could hide. He met Javier Morales on a Tuesday in October, during third-period art class. Javier was everything Elias was: confident, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that filled the room like sunlight. His family had moved from Miami 2 years earlier, and he carried himself like he'd already carved out his place in the world. "You're the new guy?" "Right," Javier asked, sliding into the seat next to Elias, his pencil sketching bold lines on a canvas. "Heard you're from some tiny town, but it's boring as hell out there." Elias blushed, fumbling his paintbrush. "It's not so bad," he mumbled. But Javier's grin made his chest feel tight, like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Their friendship bloomed fast, rooted in late-night texts and shared playlists. Javier was out, proudly so, with a rainbow pin on his backpack and a fire in his eyes when kids at school threw slurs his way. Elias envied that courage. He'd never hidden who he was in Willow Creek. But Atlanta felt different, bigger, louder, meaner. Javier saw through his hesitation. "You don't gotta shrink yourself for nobody," he said one day, tossing a pebble into the Chattahoochee River as they sat on its banks. "You're enough, Elias, just as you are." Those words lodged in Elias's heart, heavy and warm, like a stone smoothed by years of water. But home was another story. Carla's boyfriend, Greg, moved in a month after Elias arrived. Greg was a hulking man with a temper that simmered just below the surface. He didn't like Elias, not his quiet demeanor, not his weird clothes, and definitely not the way he acted. One night, when Elias came home wearing a pride bracelet Javier had given him, Greg's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" he growled, pointing at the woven rainbow on Elias's wrist. Carla, perched on the couch with a glass of wine, didn't look up. "It's nothing," Elias said, but his voice shook. Greg snorted. "Nothing? Huh. Keep that shit out of my house." The tension in the apartment grew like a storm cloud. Carla was distant, more interested in Greg than in Elias. She'd snap at him for small things: dishes left in the sink, His music too loud but never defended him when Greg's comments turned sharp. "You're too sensitive," she'd say, waving him off. Elias started spending more time with Javier, sneaking out to meet him at coffee shops or the park, where they'd talk about everything and nothing. Dreams of college. Favorite movies. The way the city lights looked at night. One evening, under a sky bruised purple, Javier leaned over and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, but it set Elias's world ablaze. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Javier whispered, and Elias felt like he could fly. But storms don't stay quiet forever. One night, Elias came home late, his lips still tingling from Javier's kiss. Greg was waiting, his face red, a half-empty beer bottle in his hand. "Where you been?" "Huh?" he slurred, stepping closer. Elias froze, his heart hammering. "Out," he said, but Greg grabbed his arm, hard enough to bruise. "Don't lie to me, kid. You think I don't know what you are?" The word he spat next made Elias flinch, a slur that cut like glass. Carla appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Greg, stop," she said, but her voice was weak, like she was afraid of him too. Elias pulled free, his pulse racing, and locked himself in his room. He called Javier, his voice shaking as he whispered what had happened. "You're not safe there?" Javier said, his tone urgent. "You need to get out." Elias wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that bad, but the fear in his gut told him Javier was right. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, the photo of his grandparents on his nightstand, a reminder of the home he'd left behind. By morning, he knew he couldn't stay. Elias packed in the gray light of dawn, his hands trembling as he stuffed clothes and his book into his duffel bag. The apartment was silent. Carla at work and Greg passed out on the couch, an empty bottle tipped over beside him. Elias took one last look at the place, sterile, cold, nothing like the home he'd known, and slipped out the door. He didn't leave a note. What was there to say? His mother hadn't fought for him, hadn't seen the way Greg's anger was a fuse waiting to ignite. He texted Javier, "I'm leaving. Can I meet you?" The reply came instantly, "Park. Now. I got you." They met under the same oak tree where they'd kissed, the air crisp with early November chill. Javier's face was tight with worry, but he pulled Elias into a hug that felt like safety. "You can't go back there," Javier said, his voice low but firm. "Greg's bad news. And your mom, she's not stepping up." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak without crying. Javier took his hand, their fingers interlocking like a promise. "Come to my place. My mom won't mind, at least for a bit." Javier's home was the opposite of Carla's apartment, warm, cluttered, alive with the smell of arroz con pollo and the sound of his younger sisters arguing over a board game. His mother, Maria, was a short woman with sharp eyes and a softer heart. When Javier explained Elias's situation, leaving out the details of Greg's slurs but not the danger, Maria didn't hesitate. "You stay as long as you need. Mijo," she said, squeezing Elias's shoulder. "No one deserves to feel unsafe." Elias mumbled a thank you, overwhelmed by her kindness. It reminded him of Ruth, of home. For a week, Elias lived in Javier's world. They shared Javier's twin bed, whispering late into the night about dreams of escaping Atlanta, maybe heading to New York or San Francisco, places where they could be themselves without looking over their shoulders. Javier's sisters teased them mercilessly, calling them the lovebirds. But it was gentle, affectionate. Elias felt a flicker of hope, like maybe he could build a life here, with Javier, with this family that felt more like his than his mother's ever had. But reality has a way of clawing back. Carla called on the 8th day, her voice sharp through the phone. Where the hell are you? Elias. Greg's pissed. And I'm not dealing with this alone. Elias's stomach twisted. I'm safe, he said. But she cut him off. You don't get to just run off. Get back here. Now. He hung up, his hands shaking. Javier, sitting beside him on the couch, took the phone gently. She doesn't get to control you, he said. You're almost 17. You've got options. Options. The word felt foreign. Elias had never felt like he had choices. Not really. His grandparents had given him love, but not a future he could plan. Carla had given him a roof, but not a home. Now, with Javier's hand in his, he wondered if he could choose something different, something brave. That night, Maria sat them down with mugs of hot chocolate. You boys need a plan, she said, her tone practical but kind. Elias, you can't stay here forever. Not because I don't want you, but because you need to be safe. Legally, Greg could cause trouble. And your mom, she might too. The words hit like a punch. Elias hadn't thought about the legal side: emancipation, custody, all the things that could tie him to Carla's world. Javier suggested going back to Willow Creek, to his grandparents. But Elias shook his head. They're old, he said quietly. I can't burden them again. Maria nodded. Thoughtful. There's a youth shelter downtown. They help kids in your situation, LGBT kids. Especially. I know someone who works there. They can help you figure things out. The idea of a shelter scared Elias, conjuring images of cold cots and strangers. But Javier's steady presence made it feel possible. They spent the next day researching. Javier hunched over his laptop, pulling up websites for shelters and legal aid. The Atlanta Youth Haven was the best option, a place that specialized in supporting queer teens, offering counseling, housing, and help with emancipation. Elias felt a spark of something he hadn't in months: control. He wasn't just running. He was choosing. But choices come with costs. That night, Elias got a text from an unknown number. You think you can just leave? I know where you are. His blood ran cold. It was Greg. Somehow, he'd gotten Javier's address. Elias showed Javier, whose jaw tightened. He's bluffing, Javier said, but his voice wavered. They told Maria, who locked the doors and called a friend who was a cop. Just in case, she said, but her calm couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. Elias barely slept, his mind racing with what-ifs. What if Greg showed up? What if Carla dragged him back? What if he lost Javier, the one person who made him feel like he belonged? By morning, he knew he couldn't stay at Javier's, not if it put them in danger. I have to go to the shelter, he told Javier, his voice breaking. Javier argued, but Elias was firm. I won't let him hurt you or your family. This is my fight. The Atlanta Youth Haven was a low brick building tucked behind a community garden. Its sign faded but welcoming. Elias arrived with Javier, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his heart a tangle of fear and resolve. Inside, the shelter smelled of coffee and cleaning supplies, and the staff a mix of tired but kind-eyed counselors greeted him with paperwork and questions. You're not alone here, said a woman named M.S. Carter, her voice warm as she handed him a pamphlet on emancipation. We've got your back. The shelter was crowded but safe, with bunk beds lining the walls and a common room where kids played cards or scrolled on shared computers. Elias met others like him, teens kicked out or running from homes that didn't understand them. There was Riley, a non-binary kid with a shaved head and a quick laugh. And Marcus, a trans boy who drew comics in a battered notebook. They made Elias feel less like an outsider, their stories weaving a thread of shared survival. But he missed Javier fiercely, their texts now his lifeline to the outside world. Javier visited every day, sneaking in snacks and stories about school. "You're gonna be okay," he'd say, squeezing Elias's hand under the table in the shelter's cafeteria. But Elias saw the worry in his eyes, the way he glanced at the door like he expected Greg to barge in. The text from Greg had stopped, but the threat lingered like a bruise. Elias called his grandparents, their voices crackling through the phone. "Come home, Eli," Ruth pleaded. But he couldn't, not yet. He needed to stand on his own. Ms. Carter helped him file for emancipation, a process that felt like climbing a mountain. He needed proof of independent school records, a job, a plan. Javier's mom connected him with a part-time gig at a local bookstore, where Elias shelved novels and tried to blend in. The work was quiet, soothing, but every creak of the door made him flinch, expecting Greg's shadow. One night, closing up alone, he saw a man lingering across the street, his build too familiar. Elias's heart raced, but the man turned and walked away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe. At the shelter, Elias started journaling, pouring his fears and hopes onto pages he kept hidden under his pillow. He wrote about Javier, the way his laugh could pull Elias out of a spiral, the way his hand felt like an anchor. He wrote about his grandparents, their love, a foundation he hadn't appreciated until it was gone. And he wrote about Carla, the mother who'd promised a home but delivered a cage. The words helped, grounding him when the world felt too big. But the past doesn't stay buried. One afternoon, Carla showed up at the shelter, her face a mix of anger and exhaustion. "You can't just run away, Elias," she said, her voice loud enough to draw stares. Ms. Carter stepped in, calm but firm, explaining that Elias was under their protection. Carla's eyes flashed. "He's my son." Elias stood, his voice steady for the first time. "You didn't want me, Mom." "Not really." The words hung between them, heavy and true. Carla left without another word, but Elias knew it wasn't over. That night, Javier snuck him out to a diner, where they shared fries and planned a future they couldn't quite see. "When you're free," Javier said, his eyes bright, "we'll get out of here. Together." Elias wanted to believe it, but fear gnawed at him. Greg's shadow loomed, and Carla's silence felt like a storm waiting to break. He kissed Javier under the diner's neon sign, clinging to the moment like it might be their last. The next day, Ms. Carter called him into her office. "Your mom's filed a custody claim," she said, her face grim. "She's saying you're a runaway, and Greg's backing her up." Elias's stomach dropped. Emancipation was months away, and Carla could drag him back to Greg, back to fear. Javier was waiting outside, his face pale when Elias told him. "We'll fight it," Javier said, but his voice shook. Elias nodded, but inside, he was already running, his mind racing for a way out. The custody claim hit like a tidal wave, pulling Elias under. He sat in the shelter's common room, staring at the legal papers Ms. Carter had given him, the words blurring as panic set in. If Carla won, he'd be forced back to her apartment, to Greg's fists and sneers. Javier sat beside him, his knee pressed against Elias's, a silent reminder he wasn't alone. "We'll find a lawyer," Javier said, scrolling through his phone for pro bono legal services. "You're not going back there." Elias wanted to believe him, but doubt was a heavy weight. He was 16, still a minor, and the law favored parents, even ones who'd failed their kids. Ms. Carter connected him with a legal aid attorney, a woman named Ms. Patel, who spoke with a calm intensity that made Elias feel seen. "You've got a strong case for emancipation," she said, reviewing his file. "Stable job, school attendance, and a clear reason to fear for your safety. But we need to move fast. Elias nodded, clinging to her words like a lifeline. Days blurred into court prep and late-night talks with Javier. The shelter became his fortress, its walls lined with stories of survival. Riley taught him how to braid friendship bracelets, their fingers working in tandem as they swapped coming-out stories. Marcus showed him his comics, vivid drawings of queer superheroes saving the world. "You're one of us," Marcus said, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "We stick together." Their support stitched Elias back together, piece by piece. But the fear of Greg lingered, a ghost he couldn't shake. One evening, Javier showed up with a plan. "There's a rally downtown," he said, his eyes alight. "For queer youth rights. Let's go. Show the world you're fighting." Elias hesitated. Crowds made him nervous. And Greg could be anywhere, but Javier's conviction was contagious. They went, joining a sea of rainbow flags and raised voices. Elias held a sign that read, "Love is not a crime," his hands shaking but his heart full. For the first time, he felt part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. But the rally wasn't all hope. As they marched, Elias spotted a familiar figure on the edge of the crowd. Greg, his face twisted in a scowl. Elias froze, his sign slipping from his hands. Javier followed his gaze and stepped in front of him. Protective. "He can't touch you here," Javier whispered. But Elias's pulse raced. Greg didn't approach, but his presence was a warning, a reminder that freedom wasn't won yet. Back at the shelter, Elias wrote in his journal, the words spilling out like a confession. He wrote about the rally, the way Javier's hand in his had felt like armor. He wrote about Greg, the fear that clung to him like damp clothes. And he wrote about his grandparents, how he wished he could call them without worrying them. He mailed them a letter, careful not to reveal his location, just words of love and promises to be okay. Ms. Patel called with news. The custody hearing was set for next month. Elias had 4 weeks to prove he could stand on his own. He threw himself into work at the bookstore, saving every penny for a future he couldn't yet see. Javier helped him study for school, quizzing him on history dates while they shared coffee in the shelter's kitchen. "You're gonna make it," Javier said one night, his voice fierce. "I believe in you." Elias kissed him, pouring all his hope and fear into it, wishing he could freeze time. But time didn't stop. One night, as Elias walked home from the bookstore, a car slowed beside him. His heart stopped when he saw Greg in the driver's seat, his eyes cold. "Get in," Greg said, his voice low and dangerous. Elias bolted, his sneakers pounding the pavement as he cut through alleys to lose him. He made it to the shelter, breathless, and told Ms. Carter everything. She called the police, but Greg was gone by the time they arrived. "We're getting a restraining order," she said, her face grim. Elias nodded, but he knew a piece of paper wouldn't stop Greg's rage. The restraining order was a thin shield, but it was something. Elias carried a copy in his pocket, its weight a reminder of the line he'd drawn. The shelter tightened security, and Ms. Carter assigned him a buddy system. No walking alone. Javier insisted on being his shadow, meeting him after work and walking him to the shelter. "I'm not letting that asshole near you," Javier said, his jaw set. Elias wanted to argue, to keep Javier safe. But the truth was, he needed him. School became a battleground. Word of the custody fight spread, and whispers followed Elias down the halls. Some kids were kind, slipping him notes of support, but others were cruel, their slurs echoing Greg's. Elias kept his head down, focusing on grades to strengthen his emancipation case. Javier was his anchor, sneaking him into the art room during lunch to paint and talk. "You're stronger than you know," Javier said, brushing paint off Elias's cheek. Elias smiled, but the fear never left him. Ms. Patel worked tirelessly, gathering statements from Maria, Ms. Carter, and even Elias's grandparents, who sent a notarized letter about his childhood. Ruth's words, written in her careful cursive, broke Elias's heart. He's a good boy. Always has been. He deserves a life where he's loved. Elias cried reading it, missing the creak of their porch and the smell of Amos's pipe. He called them, promising he'd visit soon. But the distance felt wider than ever. The hearing loomed, and Elias's nightmares grew worse. Greg's face, Carla's cold eyes, a courtroom stripping him of his freedom. Javier stayed over one night, against shelter rules, curled up beside Elias on a bunk. Whatever happens, Javier whispered, I'm with you. Elias clung to him, their breaths sinking in the dark. He wanted to believe they could outrun this, but the world felt like it was closing in. Then came a breakthrough. Ms. Patel found a precedent, a case where a queer teen in Georgia won emancipation after proving an unsafe home. It's not a guarantee, she warned, but it's hope. Elias latched onto it, pouring his energy into his emancipation essay, a raw account of his life with Carla and Greg. He wrote about Javier, too, calling him the light that kept me going. Ms. Patel read it and nodded. This is powerful. Elias, it's you. But hope is fragile. One evening, as Elias and Javier left the bookstore, Greg's car appeared again, this time blocking their path. Greg stepped out, his face a mask of rage. You think you can hide from me? He shouted, advancing. Javier pushed Elias behind him, yelling for help. A passerby called 911, and Greg fled as sirens wailed. The police took Elias's statement, but he was shaking, his mind replaying Greg's fist raised like a hammer. Javier held him, whispering, he's not going to win. Ms. Carter moved Elias to a new shelter across town, a precaution in case Greg knew his location. The new place was smaller, quieter, but Elias felt unmoored without Javier's daily visits. They texted constantly, Javier sending photos of his sister's drawings or silly selfies to make Elias smile. But the distance hurt, a reminder of how fragile their world was. Elias wrote in his journal, I'm fighting for us. But what if I lose? The night before the hearing, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat in the shelter's common room, staring at a photo Javier had sent a selfie of them at the rally, grinning under their sign. He traced Javier's face with his finger, promising himself he'd fight, no matter what. Ms. Patel called to go over his testimony, her voice steady. Tell the truth. Elias. That's enough. He nodded into the phone, his throat tight, hoping his truth was enough to set him free. The courtroom was smaller than Elias expected. A cramped room with flickering fluorescent lights and a judge who looked tired but kind. Elias sat beside Ms. Patel, his hands clammy, his emancipation essay folded in his pocket like a talisman. Javier was in the back row, his presence a quiet strength, though they couldn't speak. Carla sat across the room, her face unreadable. Greg beside her, his eyes boring into Elias. The air felt thick, like it could choke him. Ms. Patel presented Elias's case with precision, his job, his grades, the restraining order, the fear that kept him up at night. She read excerpts from his essay, her voice steady as she described his life with Carla and Greg. Elias's cheeks burned as his words filled the room, raw and exposed. The judge listened, her pen scratching notes, her face giving nothing away. Carla's lawyer argued she was a fit mother, painting Elias as a rebellious teen who'd run from responsibility. Greg's testimony was worse, his voice dripping with disdain as he called Elias troubled and ungrateful. When it was Elias's turn to speak, his legs shook as he approached the stand. He looked at Javier, whose nod was a lifeline, and took a breath. "I just want to be safe," he said, his voice cracking but clear. "My grandparents raised me to be honest, to be myself. But living with my mom and Greg, it's not a home. It's fear." He told the judge about Greg's threats, the slurs, the night he'd fled. He talked about Javier, the shelter, the life he was trying to build. "I'm not running away," he said. "I'm running towards something better." The judge asked questions about his plans, his support system, his grandparents. Elias answered honestly, his voice growing stronger. Carla's eyes stayed on the floor, but Greg's glare never wavered. When the hearing ended, the judge said she'd rule in a week. Elias left the courtroom, his heart pounding, Javier's arm around his shoulders. "You were incredible," Javier whispered, and Elias let himself believe it. Just for a moment. The waiting was agony. Elias threw himself into work and school, trying to drown out the what-ifs. Javier visited when he could, sneaking into the new shelter with Ms. Carter's blessing. They'd sit in the garden, planning a future college, an apartment, a life where they could just be. But Greg's shadow lingered. One night, Elias got a call from an unknown number. He didn't answer, but the voicemail was Greg's voice. Low and menacing. "This isn't over, kid." Elias showed Ms. Carter, who reported it to the police. They traced the call, but Greg had used a burner phone. Untraceable. The shelter went on lockdown, and Elias's fear returned. Sharper now. Javier was furious, wanting to confront Greg, but Elias begged him to stay safe. "I can't lose you," Elias said, his voice breaking. Javier pulled him close, promising he'd stay out of trouble. But the tension was a tightrope, and Elias felt it fraying. Ms. Patel called with news. The judge was leaning toward emancipation, but Carla was fighting harder, claiming Elias needed structure. Elias's stomach churned. He wrote in his journal, pages filled with anger and hope, fear and love. He wrote to Javier, words he couldn't say out loud. "You're my home, no matter where I am." He didn't send it, but it felt like a vow. The day of the ruling came, and Elias sat in the shelter's office. Ms. Carter beside him, Javier on speakerphone. Ms. Patel's voice was calm but triumphant. "The judge granted your emancipation. Elias, you're free." Tears stung his eyes as Javier cheered through the phone. Ms. Carter hugged him, and for the first time in months, Elias felt light, like he could breathe. But freedom came with a Shadow Greg's voicemail, a reminder that some battles weren't over. Emancipation was a word Elias held like a fragile bird, afraid it might fly away. He was 17 now, legally his own, but the weight of Greg's threat lingered. The shelter helped him find a shared apartment with Riley and Marcus, a small place above a laundromat that smelled of detergent and possibility. It wasn't much peeling paint, a leaky faucet, but it was his. Javier helped him move, carrying boxes and cracking jokes to keep Elias's nerves at bay. "This is your kingdom now," Javier said, kissing him in the empty living room. Life settled into a rhythm. Elias worked longer hours at the bookstore, saving for college. He and Javier studied together, dreaming of art school for Javier and literature for Elias. Riley and Marcus filled the apartment with laughter, their late-night talks about identity and survival knitting them into a chosen family. But Elias never forgot Greg. The restraining order held, but he checked locks obsessively, his heart racing at every strange noise. One evening, Javier surprised him with a trip to Willow Creek. "You need to see them," he said, meaning Ruth and Amos. The drive was long, the Tennessee hills rolling past like a memory. When Elias stepped onto his grandparents' porch, Ruth's arms enveloped him, Amos's gruff voice cracking as he said, "Missed you, boy." They sat in the kitchen, cornbread and stories filling the air. Elias told them everything: Carla, Greg, Javier, the shelter. Ruth cried. Amos gripped his hand, and Javier fit right in, charming them with his quick wit. Back in Atlanta, Elias felt stronger, grounded by his grandparents' love and Javier's presence. But peace is a fragile thing. One night, as he closed the bookstore, Greg appeared, leaning against a streetlight. "You think you're free?" he sneered, stepping closer. Elias's phone was in his hand, dialing 911 before he could think. Greg lunged, but a coworker stepped out, shouting, and Greg vanished into the dark. The police arrived, but he was gone, a ghost who wouldn't stay buried. Elias told Javier, who wanted to hunt Greg down. "No," Elias said, his voice firm. "He wants me scared. I won't give him that." Instead, he leaned on his community Riley, Marcus, MS, Carter, Javier's mom. They rallied around him, checking in, keeping him safe. MS. Patel filed a violation of the restraining order, and the police increased patrols. Elias wrote in his journal, "I'm not running anymore. This is my life." Javier threw him a birthday party, turning 17 into a celebration of survival. The apartment was packed: shelter kids, bookstore co-workers, Maria and her daughters. Javier gave him a sketchbook, filled with drawings of them together, each one a promise. "We're building something," Javier said, his voice soft. Elias kissed him, the room fading away, their love louder than any fear. But Greg wasn't done. A week later, Elias got a Laterno return address, just his name in block letters. Inside was a single sentence: "You can't hide forever." His hands shook as he showed it to MS. Carter, who called the police. They dusted for prints. Found nothing. Elias felt the walls closing in. But Javier's voice cut through. "He's trying to break you. Don't let him." Elias nodded, clinging to those words, determined to hold on. Elias knew he couldn't outrun Greg forever, but he could outlast him. He leaned into his life school, work, Javier, his chosen family. The threats didn't stop, but they became background noise, like a radio left on low. The police tracked Greg, catching him violating the restraining order one too many times. He was arrested, charged with harassment, and though it wasn't a long sentence, it was enough to give Elias breathing room. Carla faded too, her custody fight abandoned, her silence a final goodbye. Elias and Javier grew closer, their love a quiet rebellion against the world's cruelty. They planned for college, applying for scholarships, dreaming of a city where they could walk hand in hand without fear. Elias visited his grandparents often, their love a tether to his past. Ruth sent him recipes. Amos sent fishing lures, and Elias sent them letters filled with hope. One spring evening, Elias and Javier returned to the park where they'd first kissed. The oak tree was still there, its branches heavy with new leaves. Elias carved their initials into the bark, a small act of defiance against a world that had tried to break them. "We made it," he said, his voice steady. Javier smiled, pulling him close. "Yeah, we did." Elias's journal filled with new stories, not of fear, but of love, resilience, and the family he'd built. He wrote about Riley's laugh, Marcus's comics, Maria's cooking, Javier's sketches. He wrote about his grandparents, who'd loved him first, and about himself, a boy who'd fled but found his way. The last page held a single line: "I'm home." wherever I am, because I'm me. Years later, Elias would look back on that time 17, scared, but fighting, and see it as the moment he became himself. He and Javier moved to New York. Their apartment small, but theirs, filled with art and books and laughter. Greg was a memory, Carla a ghost, but Elias carried his grandparents' love and Javier's hand in his. He'd fled at 17, but he'd run towards something bigger, a life where he was enough, just as he was.